Hello, Emotep, and welcome. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Set and Knight of Shambhala, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast. Uh, in today's show, I've got two things for you. One of which is a re-editing of an old thing I did on the Magical Papyri and the kind of background to paganism and magic in the ancient world. That should take about 20 minutes, and then after that I've actually got a guest on my podcast, which is Steve D, who will explain a little bit about himself, and he's going to talk about a subject that I'm very interested in, which is the Egyptian God Seth, or Apophis. He's also going to talk about whether it's the same thing, and the work with these particular supernatural entities, especially in context of the Temple of Set, and a bit broader than that as well. So stay tuned, as they say, for the podcast. But first, let me just play something I recorded about the PGM, or the Greek Magical Papyri.
The influence of ancient Egypt, of course, is still relevant to everybody, not just pagans such as myself. It's part of the European consciousness, or what's sometimes called European mind. But for now, I'm focusing on what might be interesting in this from a kind of neo-pagan, new religious movement point of view. I should say, when I say pagan, I don't follow I suppose the majority view that pagan means country dweller, or whatever. I think that's a possible interpretation, but as far as I know, that interpretation of the word pagan only really got any traction in the West in the scholastic period, in the European Middle Ages. The original meaning, and another possible original meaning, is that it's a kind of new religion, really, of the classical world, and it's really those who haven't signed up. It means civilian is one possible meaning of pagan. Those who haven't signed up to the kind of army of God. I mean, usually meaning Christianity was kind of, at the time, used this kind of quite martial way of describing their religion, and people were enrolled. The oath that they took, they're enrolled into almost like a military fraternity in a way, but with religious aims, the army of God. It's not a kind of modern time. We have things like the Salvation Army, of course. It interests me too that paganism then is a interfaith thing. It's a new religion in the classical world that kind of combines lots of other religions. Perhaps you'd say the best bits, the bits that they need to keep, because they're under pressure. They're under pressure. If you like, the writing's on the wall, and when you're under pressure, comparative religious studies show that where this happens, people kind of work out what they need to keep and what is not so important, and so you get an idea of what is really important to people from the summaries and constructions they make under pressure. One of the important things of that is that magic itself at the time is a religion, really. Magic is a religion, and certainly part of this new religion that becomes paganism. But it's almost like we could take magic as a religion in its own right. Okay, so that's the kind of trajectory I want to look at. I should say as well why we, as pagans, I've mentioned this many times, I know, in the other film, but I still think it's worth pointing out that there are 10 measures of magic that are said to have come into the world, and Egypt received 9 of those. This is why Egypt takes up so much of our time, is because so much of the stuff that we practice kind of seems to come from there. Now, the magical world is currently undergoing something of a revolution in terms of the emergence of various new studies, but primarily there's a kind of collection, a magician's library that was found a long time ago, actually, almost 100 years ago, more than that maybe, which is really only in the last 20 years, or certainly in the last 20 years, or more than that, since 1986, the importance of this collection has really transforming everything, not just studies of classical magic and Egyptian magic, but it's transforming the way everybody else looks at magic, really, in other traditions that are not even supposedly related to magic. So this was a magician's library. So at a time when the world of religion was in the West was kind of changing in the Middle East, and that Christianity was on the rise, and the Abrahamic faiths were coming to the fore, and paganism was supposedly going into some sort of decline. So this maybe explains why this magician's library existed, perhaps because so many books were being burned at the time, say 2,000 years ago, in the time of the Roman Empire, when the Romans were in Egypt. Books were being burnt, especially magicians' books. Magicians themselves were being burnt, to be honest. But certainly there was a kind of an anti-intellectual mood. An awful lot of scientific and technical books were destroyed in that moment, and perhaps some magician is known from other sources that a magician from Upper Egypt, from Thebes, is probably the author, probably is a single author of this whole collection of manuscripts, even though it's quite large. Perhaps he, realizing that the writing was on the wall, or perhaps local conditions, local pogroms in a way, local sort of agitation by Christian groups and other religious groups to kind of get this material and destroy it if they possibly could. Perhaps that's why he thought, as a precaution, he'd do what a lot of people have done when they want to preserve manuscripts. He sealed them up in clay pots and buried them in the desert in a secret spot that he could find later. And if you've ever been to that sort of area, you realise that there are plenty of nooks and crannies that you could hide something that would probably never be visited again for a very long time, unless you really know where you're going. But in fact, maybe something happened to him or her, could be a woman, whatever. They obviously never returned to reclaim their library, and which is bad for them, but lucky for us, because it means that we have this collection of books, or manuscripts and grimoires, if you like, which is very, very complicated body of stuff. I should say it's not. I'm talking about a thing that normally referred to, or commonly referred to, as a PGM, the Greek Magical Papyri, and that name puts you off the scent, really. It's a misnomer, because most of these manuscripts, certainly a high percentage of this manuscript, is not written in Greek. It's written in the Egyptian tongue, in the Demotic, really. So. But because they kind of eradicated, because of a Greek bias, because of a bias towards Greek culture, they tended to kind of only find interesting or see the Greek collection. So they kind of named it that, and that kind of gives you the impression, when you hear that name, the Greek Magical Papyri, you probably think, oh well, it's all Greek material, it's not Egyptian material at all. But as with so much of this material that we get, the context and the writing and the authorship is actually Egyptian. It's the real centre of learning and synthesis of this sort of material in the ancient world. So that's why often people are trying to rename it now, either the Theban Magical Library or just the Magical Papyri. Less misleading than Greek. Not to say Greek doesn't form an important part of this tradition. It's just, for a long time it put people off the scent in a way. And these works are essentially works of Egyptian magic, whatever the language. The scholars have decided, looking at the material, that someone with that level of skill and being so multilingual as well, being able to have knowledge of so many different languages, including the Egyptian one and the Greek one, there's only one kind of group of people who really fit that profile, and that's almost certainly an Egyptian priest from Thebes, obviously doing a bit of work on the side though. and this is probably their own collection. One of the other interesting ways of looking at this collection, I know we haven't gone on to dance yet, I don't know, but I think this is an important context because, you know, they're connected. The dance is a way of giving life to this material. They're connected. You know, you may well have heard of a kind of collection of philosophical texts called the Corpus Hermetica, which are, I suppose you say, theological or philosophical texts, again made in this same period. They're an attempt to kind of to boil down the essence of truth, especially from an esoteric point of view, and to write that down in a series of Neoplatonic dialogues, I suppose. So the Corpus Hermetica, again, it has the same context really, and one way of looking at the Corpus Hermetica, that's the kind of theory, and the underlying religion in the Corpus Hermetica is Egyptian, essentially, if you look at it closely enough, even if it might be intertranslated into Greek gods and goddesses most of the time. Say for instance in the case of Helios, it's obviously clear that they're talking that they could equally well be talking about the Egyptian god Amun. And the connection, the Corpus Hermetica could be thought of as the theoretical, and the Magical Papyri, the Greek Magical Papyri, if you like, that I mentioned just now, they're the practical element of it. Theory and practice, they belong together in lots of ways, and one makes sense of the other. I should say, I suppose it's obvious from what maybe that so far a lot of the magical tradition has been perhaps overly viewed through the prism of classical Greeks and classical Greek philosophical tradition, which is why so many things get missed out or get ignored. And that's changing now. So there's an emphasis to try and refocus the way we look at things, either to look at them in their own right or to look at them from the point of view of classicism and Greece, but to look at them from the point of view of Egypt, and beyond that from the point of view of Africa. Now, the guy who made the classical edition of the PGM argues in his intro, in fact, that we might, in fact, view Magick of the time that these things were written. What emerges is that magic is a religion then in its own right. It has its own way of looking at the world, its own gods and goddesses that it particularly works with, usually a preference for underworld deities, which we've forgotten about really. We assume that, you know, we've forgotten as modern pagans that a lot of the gods and goddesses that we work with would have been considered quite night-side underworld deities in the ancient world, and we're happy with that. And there is also, I suppose, a concentration in the magic of the time, as you get in these texts, on what you would call Typhonian deities, not just underworld, but slightly threatening, awesome entities in one way or another. So those are the kind of ways that I approach this material. And as I say, there's a whole lot of, I mean, I'm just giving you my ideas, there's a whole lot of people in the contemporary magical community now who are very busily engaged in excavating this rich collection of texts, and it's probably going to take a while before we fully get it on board. And one thing that you spot with all this is there's a continuity from ancient magic over time, over vast periods of time, between prehistoric or the pre-dynastic stuff to even into the modern world really, which is a theme that I often explore. And as well as continuity of ideas, there's also innovation, right? There's continuity and there's change. New ideas pop up all the time, and new things that are found to be useful for the magician to do. A good example of that would be in the classical period the rise of the mystery cult, which is a kind of religious innovation really. Nobody's quite sure if it existed like that before. The examples of the cult of Isis and all this kind of stuff that we know of from the classical world, there's some indication that there may have been something like that before, but that's another issue. So whenever we get involved with magic, we're dealing with a religious tradition that's extremely old and familiar, but it always very soon takes us back to our very beginnings, to the origins of things, to the kind of first things that we did really. And nowhere I think is that better illustrated than in the subject of dance, surprisingly. Dance in itself and movement is, in a sense, it's, you could say we know about it, but it's also, we take it for granted, but that is almost, you could say, one of the oldest forms of magic, one way or another. There's always music and movement. There's almost always dance in magic. Dance, if you like, is related. I've talked before about image magic, how magic is very focused on the construction of images, and the enlivening, or the vivification of images in some ways, the bringing of images to life and letting them move. This, in a sense, this is our oldest language, the language of the body. Leon Trotsky, the famous linguist, has talked about a thing called the transformational grammar, which is a kind of deep, embedded form of language that kind of almost universal. It's almost in our genes, if you follow his point of view. And image magic, music, dance, if anything is going to be the transformational grammar, that's where you've got to kind of look, I think, is in this sort of basic language of signs.
Okay, well, as promised, here's me and Steve D talking about the Egyptian god Seth, and he begins gets straight in there with an introduction to who he is and the books that he's written.
Hi Mog, it's Steve D here. So my name is Steve and I am a magical practitioner and psychotherapist living in Devon in the UK. I'm also an author of a number of books which I've probably mentioned: A Gnostic's Progress, Chaos Monk, The Heretic's Journey, and Chaos Craft with Julian Vane. In terms of who Set is to me, I was a former member of the Temple of Set for some years, about 4 years, and so I like that idea of Set being, they would use the term isolate intelligence, but what they mean by that is self-awareness and consciousness. So Set represents those things, and individualism, which I think fits well with the work of the magician. Set also has an outsider quality, so he represents kind of creativity, freedom, free thinking to me. So and I think that's his value to the world.
Thank you for your introduction. What I'd like you to do for the listeners to the Egyptian Magic podcast is talk a little bit about your interests in Egyptian magic and religion. I know you're interested in lots of other things, other aspects of religion, but I particularly like to start with your views about Egypt.
I'm told you have quite an interesting, important, and illuminating view on the god Seth, who is of particular interest to me, as you know. But I'd really like to record your and hear your initial gambit on Seth. What you think the meaning of the god Seth is, what their importance is, and perhaps at the same time, I was rather struck. Someone told me that your take on the Egyptian deity Apep or Apophis is also very interesting. And sometimes you could deal with them both together or in two different slots, in the sense that there's a certain amount of debate of whether they're the same entity. Anyway, start with just give me your considered opinion on the god Set and the significance of that to a magician or spiritual philosopher, people follow a spiritual path in the modern world, if you could.
So yeah, how did I get into Set? That's a good question. I think you're partially to blame, Mog. I remember, you and I have known each other for over 20 years, and when you and I started working with some of the Amokos material, I saw that Set figured largely in your thinking. So really interested in this Egyptian deity that in some way could be connected to Tantra traditions. But also for me, Set represented something quite scary. And as you've observed, he is like a gateway to initiation, so like a threshold. So there's often, for me, there used to be quite a lot of anxiety in working with Set, and even now sometimes it kind of spooks me out slightly. But in a way that I think as an initiate can be quite important, that we have to work with those aspects of ourselves that sometimes scare us. So for me, Set represents some of that and continues to do so. So it's challenging, but really important, I think, for my development as a magician, but also as a human being. So I got involved with the Temple of Set. I'd read the works of Edward Thornton, Stephen Flowers, probably about 25 years ago. But then I was working with a previous magister within the temple, Michael Kelly, who's written an excellent book called Apophis and other works. And it was really through him that I was introduced to the philosophy of the temple. And I think that's what attracted me, really. That Michael Aquino, who was a senior member of the Church of Satan, left in 1975 and founded the temple upon his encounter with Set as a manifestation of what he called the Prince of Darkness. And kind of key to that is this idea of Kepha, which is a very familiar one to those who know about Egyptian magic, and the idea of becoming. And so I was attracted to the temple because of the way it articulated really clearly this idea of becoming. And with my interest in Gnosticism and the kind of awakening of the Gurdjieff work, the temple was a good fit.
Yeah, that's really good, and happy to learn about my role in that. Could you go on and say a bit then? You said that you then went on to join the Temple of Set. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about start with the obvious, how you learnt about them in the first place, and then what made you
join them, I suppose, is one thing. Or yeah, how did that come about, and what did you actually do in that organization? And how I get the feeling you were maybe not so involved with them anymore. I'm sure you use the past tense, but anyway, tell a little bit the story of the Temple of Set and their particular take on that. I know you mentioned a little bit about that already, and how it went. I think people are quite interested to know about the organisation, if you can, without sort of divulging any order secrets or whatever. But what you can say, that'll be good.
And just to expand upon that, really, within the temple, it's quite a laborious or prolonged process to become what's called a Setian, which is the first grade, and the work of that first grade is really about understanding the temple's philosophy and its specific perspectives on magic, which are quite unique, I think. They're articulated well in Michael Aquino's book, The Temple of Set Volume 1, which I think you can get on Amazon. And the focus of what they call greater black magic is really on the initiate and the changing and the transformation of self. As I said, kind of seeing Set as the exemplar of that alchemical process of change and becoming one's true self, which I think for me also has some parallels with Crowley's word thelema, finding one's true will and also potentially contacting one's holy guardian angel. So I think all of those concepts are held within the word Kepha that the temple teaches.
That's really interesting line of thought, Steve. Can you sort of develop it a bit more, really? You talked a bit about this Egyptian word Kepha and how important that was as a central concept within the Temple of Set. Yeah, tell us a bit more about that, how you kind of specifically work with that, what the implications are, and how you developed, because you were in the Temple of Set for several years, I think. So how did the work go, and what was the next stage, I suppose, after that? But start with the Kepha stuff. Expand it into how that develops into a kind of quite a rich magical system, I would imagine.
Yeah, to say a little bit more about Kepha, or the process, which we could call Kephering, if you like. I think this relates to the initiatory focus of the temple. So while it uses magic as a technique for initiation, I think it would be less of a magical order than something, say, like the Golden Dawn, or perhaps something like the IoT, as a contemporary example. So Kepha is the process of unfolding the self. If Set is the principle of consciousness, the aim for the initiate who's following the path of Set is the unfolding of their true self. And of course, that is going to be unique to each individual. So for some individuals, that might relate to understanding their sexuality more fully, or expressing artistic skills that perhaps have been suppressed or not even discovered yet. So what Kepha and that becoming, that unfolding, will mean is unique to the individual. And to try and answer the second part of your question, Mog, well, the temple certainly has ritual magic practices and formulas that they use that look a lot like rituals, from other traditions. but focused, as I said previously, on initiation. But within the temple, they have subgroups called elements, which would often focus on special interests like music, art, all sorts of approaches. And then for those who reach the grade of adept, which is the second degree, then they could potentially join an order, which again is a specialist school within the temple that might focus on specific forms of initiatory work, such as the Order of the Vampire or the Order of Tiamat, which focuses on Mesopotamian forms of magic. So, as you noticed, I have left, and I think for me that's just about, in the life of a practitioner, things have a value for a time, but you don't need to stay there forever, and sometimes you get what you need from that context, and you've got to be open to moving on. So no bad blood, but moving on.
That's great, Steve. That's really clear, and very interesting insight into working with the Temple of Set and their particular development of the mythos. Something I hope you kind of talk about now is, and this comes up because a couple of years ago you mentioned Michael Kelly and his book on Apophis, and a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a conference in Glastonbury, and Michael Kelly was scheduled to speak on, presumably on Apophis or Set or whatever. But anyway, rather kind of appropriately in a way, there was a terrible storms lashing the whole of the UK during that weekend, and he lives on the Isle of Man, I think, or somewhere that required a journey over the sea to get to Glastonbury. And so he just couldn't get there. There's just no way. Flights were grounded, and ferries weren't really sailing, or it was being a bit unpleasant. It was just too dangerous. And I'm told that you I was actually at the same conference, so I wasn't able to catch what you did, but I told that you filled in for Michael Kelly. You did his talk for him, and people who were at the talk said it was really good. It was very, very enlightening. I'm sure Michael Kelly would have been very, very good as well. But it was kind of remarkable. It was one of those things, as I said, it was a very. So I was wondering if I might prevail upon you to repeat the performance and talk a little bit about either Michael Kelly's or presumably your own views on crossover on this other very interesting supernatural entity from the Egyptian tradition, who people, for all sorts of good reasons, often conflate or put together with God Seth. Is almost kind of viewed as being the other side of the coin, or even just another name for the God Seth. And there's a certain amount of basis for that in terms of the later development of the Setian mythos in Egypt itself, especially in the late period, although even that is disputed. But certainly the further you go on there seems to be the two entities, Set the god and Apophis, this ancient supernatural entity, are often synonymous, treated as synonymous. So it's very interesting entity. I'd be very interested to know what you make of that, and especially this relationship between the two, or if they are just another name for it, and how that fits with your whole view about the Setian mythos. Anyway, there you go. Over to you.
Yes, Mog, I remember that talk, and needing to step in with maybe about a week's notice or a couple of days' notice to do it. But yeah, it was fine. And, at that time, back whenever that was, probably, 2015 or something, 16, I was quite involved in working with Michael Kelly's book and his curriculum in Apophis, in which, in that he sets out a schema of the, I think it's the 7 heads of the dragon, based on that image in the book of Revelation, and each head represents like a level of magical initiation, and and what he would call on the left-hand path, or the Temple of Set uses that phrase as well, by which they mean, for them, the left-hand path is a focus on the self and development of the self, and each of those heads becomes like a gateway, working with the body, working with dreams, all different aspects that the magician would hopefully aspire to activate. So yeah, it was a really good book, and I was really pleased, because Michael couldn't do it, to speak on his behalf, and I think people received it well. As to the role of Apophis, I know for some people in the mythos, the world serpent is seen as evil, but I suppose I see it as kind of chaos or potentiality, the raw material of the cosmos, and including ourselves. And I think for me, part of the relationship between Set and Apophis, or Apep, is in that famous image on Ra's bark of Set dealing with Apophis. I think that is a very central key, and that only Set, as the god of consciousness and the god of darkness and storms, could to deal with Apophis as raw chaos potentiality. So I think in some ways Set, going back to the idea of a gateway, he is the key to being able to work with that raw potentiality. And yeah, that's a potentially dangerous place to be, but also for the magician, a potentially very powerful place to be. So yeah, that image for me is central, and meditation on that can be quite important. So for me, thinking about why this work is so important, I think once you go down a magical path for some time, and you get beyond the lust for results, as we might call it, we're asked, what's the deeper meaning of our work? And for me, the image of Set confronting Apep is to do with us as magicians managing and trying to work with the chaos and potential of life through understanding our own shadow, our own most powerful drives. That might be quite Freudian in some way, but connecting to things like our sexuality, our creativity, not to get stuck there or overindulge them, but to see them as a source of energy. And again, it's connected to that old adage of knowing thyself, that to do magical work with any kind of groundedness and sustained, or in a sustained fashion, we need to work with the reality of who we are.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Steve D, for that very insightful discussion on Set and Apep, and the relevance of it to magical work. That's it for the Egyptian podcast this time. Do please check us out on YouTube and Spotify for previous programs, and perhaps consider subscribing to the channel so you'll get some of the good things coming up. So, Zenebti.